Hello and welcome to week 3 of Strategy Implementation Management 60680 at Texas Christian University. This week, the key topic we're going to talk about is execution variables. In any strategic plan, there's an element to say there's going to be potential challenges, roadblocks, or speed bumps that are going to occur when we actually execute our plan. Now, first off, no one has a crystal ball. No one can predict the exact future of what's going to happen when we implement a strategy. However, though, based on various dynamics and various considerations, we can actually come up with a list of potential variables that we need to consider in the formulation of the strategy phase and also into the actions we take in execution to ensure those variables are at least considered and analyzed. So there's key things you need to do when you're talking about execution variables. First, you need to define them early. You need to define them directionally. We need to define assumptions on these variables. We need to define the potential speed bumps and define the ability to pivot. Let's look at these in more detail. First, we need to define our variables early. This generally happens in the strategy formulation or also into the blueprint of our implementation phase. Generally needs to happen before we actually start implementation, but it's critical as part of our implementation strategy. First thing we do is we use history. History in our company, more internal than anything. We look at similar strategies that we've conducted and any types of challenges or roadblocks or variables that have occurred before, are they potentially going to happen again? Because quite frankly, we have similar customers, like company dynamics, things that organizational structure, things that may, again, be another impact or potential variable consideration towards our existing strategy. So that needs to be looked at first. Use history because generally at times, yes, history may repeat itself or some form of it. So we need to consider that first. Then you look at using past experiences. Now, it's similar to history, but what we say is those we look more from strategy to strategy. Not just the history of our company and all the other kind of higher level dynamics, but it's also looking at if we're going to implement another strategy, have we done something similar before, or was at least our approach, our process we took similar or planning to, and what kinds of variables did uncover itself from past experiences? Okay, so that's very important. The third is using analytics. Now, analytics is both internal and external, but from an internal perspective, we need to let analytics data help drive our decisions. We need to let the analytics show us potential trends that are going on with our market, potential trends that are going on internally, whatever types of insights we can gather to help us define early on those potential variables that may come up as considerations in our execution plan. Now, market research is a little bit different to where it's not using internal analytics or internal data. We're looking at market data. We're looking at market insights from either market research firms, from our own focus group research, from our own research period, whatever kind of market dynamics that can help us understand potential variables that are coming up. Perhaps consumer behavior insights, perhaps competitive insights, whatever kind of external insights we can get, those types of things helps us identify early on potential variables that may come up. But no matter how much data you have or how many analytics or market research insights you have, at times you also need to use intuition and at times gut instinct. You need to make a judgment call based off, similar experiences that you have or the leadership team has had. You kind of come together and say, look, just based off what I know and what potentially may happen, here's what I think potential considerations of variables might be, right? And some of that is data driven. Some of that is based off historical experiences, or it could just be the nature of what's taking place in front of you. Perhaps it's a whole new strategy that you don't really have a lot of case study examples to go off of. Well, at times you use your experience of what you know about the business, what you know about your customers, what you know about your competitors, just to formulate a potential consideration or variable. But no matter what, it's all about defining them early. Defining them early as early on as possible helps you at least put out there a potential risk, a potential roadblock that may occur. The earlier you can try to have some of those variables decided, perhaps you can develop a potential risk mitigation or contingency plan to work around them or work through those challenges. The next is you need to define your variables directionally, because again, there is no crystal ball. There is no exact answer to what could occur, but directionally, It gives you an insight of what may occur, much better than a vague or unclear perspective of that variable. So you want your variables to have perspectives with some sound behind it, some logic behind it. All right, so first thing you always do is consider the impact. Is this variable going to impact us from a quantitative or qualitative metric perspective? Is it going to hurt our KPI? Is the impact high or low? How much of an impact is this? You have to understand that from a directional perspective, that if this challenge does occur and this roadblock does come up, what is the potential impact it could have on our overall strategy? Now, you're not going to know exactly the impact until you hit it dead on if it does come up in reality, but you can use, like, again, history, you can use analytics, you can use case examples to where you can at least identify directionally that impact. You also need to consider directionally the probability. Is it likely to occur? Is it very likely to occur? Is it a low chance it could occur? This is where you do your risk assessment to define directionally if these variables are even something that can happen or not. For example, if you're doing a marketing strategy on a society issue that's very, very heated, very driven in the market, then there's a high probability that's going to be some reaction to the market, either positive or negative. You can make that high probable outcome based on or directional variable based on other types of campaigns that may have been ran before in a marketing strategy perspective. That's an example. Now, what you also need to do is consider directionally the obstacles themselves. What is that obstacle? Is it, for example, like I used in that marketing strategy, is it customer feedback? Is it customer reaction in the market? Is it reputation? What is it overall that's going to drive the actual challenge for you? What is that exact obstacle? Okay, define that directionally. Consider the source of those obstacles. Where is it coming from? Is it internal? Is it external? If it's internal, is it a people dynamic, a process dynamic, a quote unquote political dynamic within my company, as in the bureaucracy? Is it a structure problem? Is the source of the obstacle more of a macro perspective, something that's out of our control? You have to be able to directionally say this could be a potential directional obstacle for us, and this is where it's coming from and why. Knowing the source can help you also prepare a contingency plan to also work through it depending on where it's coming from. And consider the unknown but likely. What this means is there's considerations directionally about other things that likely could occur, secondary things, right? It's not saying that these are exactly going to happen, but it could be. It's more of the maybe list, whereas there's directional impacts or directional variables that more than likely can occur. This is more about the potential middle level potential things that still could occur. So have those documented as well and thought through. One of the key things you have to do when it talks about analyzing your variables is also the assumptions. Now, the quote over here on the right says, assumption analysis is a technique that explores the accuracy of the assumptions and identifies risks to the project from their inaccuracy, inconsistency, or incompleteness. You have to make your directional variable considerations based off assumptions. So they kind of go hand in hand, but your assumptions have to be sound. They have to have some type of backing behind it, okay? Assumptions based on merit. What that means is that is it credible or not? Is it a trustworthy assumption or not? Is there enough of that backup evidence that you can support to say, based on merit, we can all buy in to say this is the potential assumption on this variable. Base it on analytics and research. Very similar to defining it early on, but the assumptions have to have something, again, fact-based evidence or some type of qualitative insight to support the assumption. The assumption based on valued input from team members and stakeholders. The other thing you want to do is just ensure that you have the right sources of assumptions, that this has been scoped out with the right team members, that the right executives or stakeholders are able to provide their input on the assumptions of the variables and get enough of that sample size or enough of that buy-in that these variables are in fact assumed by not just one perspective but multiple, because it's generally going to be multiple stakeholders or perspectives that are going to have to come together to solve those potential variable problems. So you need to have it up front. Those assumptions are based on valued input. I put valued because it's also about valuable assumptions, not wasting our time on inconsistent or inaccurate assumptions either. That's valuable insights that we're going to make judgment calls off of versus just hearsay or opinionated assumptions. Some of this has to be relied on valuable insights. Assumptions based on macro dynamics. We need to make assumptions based off that market research and also that macro perspective. What are those macro dynamics, politics, society, shifts in law, whatever dynamics that are out of our quote unquote control, do we have to make assumptions based off of? With a new administration change for the presidency and overall government, with the new laws being enacted, with the new potential other society issues that are emerging, how do those fit in, and how do we make sound judgment assumptions based off that? And that goes back to base assumptions on logic and not always emotion. Yes, we can have passion or have an emotional tie to our strategy, but we need to use more of our logic based on the evidence, based on what's in front of us, to use that assumption analysis to make sound judgment calls on what we believe are assumed variables and obstacles that may come up based off logic. Now define your speed bumps. Okay, this is where you do get tactical and say, what are those speed bumps going to be? There are issues that are what may be and issues that will be. Okay, so you need to define that. This is where you define the will be. Okay, you need to be very specific that this will likely occur or has a high probability. Spend more time in this area than just those with a lower. Now, earlier we talked about the probability piece. Do that, but now when you get into that list of probable, potential, highly potential speed bumps or roadblocks or bottlenecks, whatever you want to call it, this is where you spend more time defining it. Define that level of impact further. Define that mitigation plan or contingency plan to work through it or around it. And then to have clear, defined decision-making rights. This is where it's critical to know who to go to in a time of need. And when these speed bumps occur, who do I go to make sure we have control of the wheel behind the car, right? Who do I go to ensure I coordinate the effort to get the job done if we need to pivot, which we'll go to next. But this is where you go again to those high probable or more than likely potential variables and considerations and spend more time having that quote unquote backup plan to remedy the problem. To get to that point of speed bump identification and analysis, then you need to define the ability to pivot. Okay, love the diagram here. It says pivot, don't pause. Don't keep going and don't stop the strategy if you can still pivot and do something to make it as sustainable as possible and to see an outcome you're looking for, right? Things do come up, challenges do occur, but it's knowing when to change that course, ensuring at the right time we've identified a problem. Here's where we're going to pivot to not make this more of a negative impact that it already potentially could be. Use data, use data, use data. Continue that real-time success measurement. Continue looking at the insights. Ensure using data to help drive your decisions. Allow the pivot to be embraced, not always a negative change. What it means is, in a moment of time, we may say, oh man, we're turning in the wrong direction and it doesn't feel positive. But if we can do something right to problem solve and course correct and pivot in the right direction, embrace that as a good opportunity, as a positive change, and that we can learn something from it too. And it says learn quickly and pivot necessarily. So what it means is don't always have to pivot though. If you have time, you want to see a trend develop before you do pivot, then know the right time and place. It's also defining the ability to pivot at the right time. Doesn't mean you always have to pivot, but it means pivoting at the right time. Let's learn, and let's learn as we go. So those are overall the various considerations for defining your variables. Very important from the ground up, no matter what execution process you choose, no matter what method you choose, those are overall the types of framework on thought process you need to have on identifying potential roadblocks, speed bumps, variables that may come up in your execution phase. But now we talk about the next three types of execution processes from the textbook. The first one you read about was the change acceleration process. This has key principles around overall the need to pivot. Okay, so when we talk about a consideration of variables tonight in this lecture, we also talked about the importance of having and embracing pivoting when you need to. So overall, the pros of this process is it's strong for cross-functional and a teams-oriented structure. It really fosters a collaboration of teamwork and bottoms-up planning, which can be great in that type of structure where it's needed. Okay, it fosters the pivot as needed mentality. It allows you to say when it is the right time, we need to pivot and do something with it. We're not so stuck on our original plan. We're going to find ways to be strategic and continue down the outcome we're looking for, but pivot in a time of need. So it works very well on volatile and complex strategies. Complex strategies are the ones that have a lot of dynamics and variables to consider, ones that come up. So it's how you manage those in the time of need to ensure that you're actioning them. Okay. So it focuses on milestone driven activities. It's also has a great method to ensuring milestones are achieved and how to measure that along the way. Okay. It also ensures that barriers are broken down where they're necessary and you can pivot again at an accelerated format, that it's not going to sit and wait to make a decision to pivot as necessary. It has a great pivot type of mindset. Now, some of the cons of this process, though, it has to refocus motivation tactics, which can be challenging to re-energize a workforce already challenged with current variables. So think about this: your team's already going down a path of doing a process and executing the plan. Well, then you tell them now you got to change it. Well, they may understand it the first time, but then you come back maybe a second or even third time as you're executing a plan. And at each interval of change and pivoting, you've got to re-energize them, re-advocate what you're doing, re-engage them, re-educate on what you're doing and why, maybe re-explain the pivot and what you're doing. But that motivation has to get there too. And people like to see things through. So if change management is influenced as a core team, right? Change management isn't handled by the majority; it's actually handled by a minority. It's handled by those we call it volunteer, kind of almost task force of individuals who are going to take it upon themselves to ensure the overall strategy is flowing. But I'm also going to help with the change management piece. So it can be challenging from that perspective, and it's less useful in this type of this process is less useful in the top heavy and traditional structures because this is a little more agile, right? It involves all stakeholder input from all levels, and quite frankly, it doesn't foster the ability just to keep on a direct plan and direct path with some risk mitigation. But this one really fosters let's change quick, and you have to have an openness to change, which can be hard in traditional structures. So that overall, that's the change acceleration process. Again, really good for agile, work type cultures, very good for team oriented, and really good at pivoting as needed. So mainly though for very complex strategies, this definitely does work. The next is resource allocation process. So this one is all about, optimizing your resources. It's all about a very strong bottoms up approach. And it's very much in regards to a very similar mindset of Lean Six Sigma. But the difference here is, though, it's not always looking just at wasted resources. It's actually looking at putting the effort and emphasis on specialization. So really, it optimizes talent and technology. It's saying, let's look at our talent and technology. Let's look at what our systems are doing. How do we focus on that? What are our strengths? And it's really from if you look from a SWOT analysis perspective, it's really optimizing your strengths with your resources and truly putting more emphasis on that to get the job done. It has a great bottoms up focus. It has a lot of input from all stakeholders and all employees, and has flexibility in resources. Though what this does, though, it pivots. That it has a little more flexibility in saying, you know what, we're very heavy in this one area, but we see a pivot now that we need to take place. Let's transition those resources with some agility, maybe cross training or cross functional skill sets to move over here. Okay, so it focuses on those specializations as needed, reducing wasted resource and time. Very similar to Lean Six Sigma. However, though, it's just not always for a long period of time. It can be very short intervals of time where resources are shifted. I think about a lot of information technology projects where the core fundamentals of programming development are there, but as the project develops, the needs for certain resources can pivot too based off where you're at in the strategic project for implementation of a, a platform or software. Okay, where what you were doing today, programmer or developer, I'm going to take you now and put you over here because I need more emphasis and execution over here. If you have a very complex strategy that has a lot of intersections and a lot of dependencies, where a lot of interaction is between different departments, that could happen as well, where resources are going to be pivoted or allocated where they're most needed at any given point in time. However, though, the con to this, though, it's unknown to the need to pivot resources is a challenge. At times, though, we may not know exactly where to allocate. Now, we identify based off of analysis and trends and what's taking place in the existing execution of a project and implementation. But it's hard to always identify exactly how much of our resources we need to pivot or allocate, or how much time it's going to take. So that's the part of the challenge. It's also how to budget for these allocations. When you're planning your projects and you're planning a budget for a strategy, you come up with a fundamental forecast of resource times you need, or a budget of capital that you have to implement a strategy. Well, you don't always know what you don't know yet and how much of that resource it's going to take. So you estimate. You do a range of hours. Perhaps it's going to be a working hours of 40 to 60. So as long as we're within 40 and 60 hours of work, that's what we can afford. Now, maybe it goes beyond 60, maybe it goes below 40. But you want to have somewhat of a relative directional, assumption-based insight based off similar work you've done before, similar strategies you've executed. This is where you can allocate those potential budgets. Flexibility may hinder true potential outcome. Now, that flexibility also can say there are times where we look at allocating resources too much. We need to keep people focused a little bit longer, and we move too quick to reallocate resources into something else where we didn't really finish out the first job or the job before that as well as we should have. That happens too in a time of need or desire, or unfortunately, lack of strategic oversight. If you have a lack of strategic leadership involved to understand how the resources are performing, then a decision could be made at a very higher level to say pivot those resources without the understanding that they need to finish what they already are doing before they move on to the next task. So that's why communication and planning is very, very important in real-time measurement. The last one, simple rules process. Now, simple rules is simply that. It's simple, okay? Like any other process, it's going to define a clear, by the way, any of the processes we talked about tonight have a formulation that's very similar, identifying the objective, the vision, but now when you get to the tactical piece about how to implement, this one is very focused on deliberate and emergent strategies. This is one where you don't really have as much of a reaction, more as a proactive mindset for deliberate strategies. And it focuses really on those bottlenecks, those variables, right? Those roadblocks. Okay. It's focused a lot on just reducing the complexity of those and not as much about optimizing talent, optimizing their technology. They're more focused on what is my road ahead, what are those roadblocks, and what are those roadblocks or bottlenecks, and how can I ensure those bottlenecks don't cause a deficiency or ineffective execution. These are really good for production-oriented, very process-oriented strategies, right? Where it's all about the handoff from one task to the next. They're really focused on the tactical piece. So if there is that, right? Let's say it's a supply chain strategy. This may work because in supply chain, there's a lot of movement, right? A lot of value chain things where things have to happen A before B, before C. And if A and B aren't done right, then there's no way C will be done right, right? There's a sequence of events. So in the sequence of events, that makes sense to fix and optimize those bottlenecks. That's good. Now the cons are it doesn't always work for structures. Focus on outcomes versus processes. Again, like I said, like in a supply chain strategy perspective, very process driven, okay? Very focused on A to B to C every step of the way and removing bottlenecks to get each step done efficiently, right? But it doesn't really look at the long-term outcome as much as it does the short-term outcome, right? That depends on the strategy, what you're doing, okay? If it's very tactical, if it's very order of events dependent, like a supply chain strategy, this may work. And it tends to get more micro in thought in the process and doesn't look at the landscape enough. Like I said, it's focused very much on the step-by-step, but doesn't look at the overall landscape of what needs to get done or measurement of what needs to get done either. So it's very finite, it's very focused. Like I said, it can work though for a very production-driven, very operationally driven type of strategy. That concludes week 3. Thank you so much for your time. I hope this was a brief overview of the topic around how to review what it means to consider your variables in the execution phase. Put some logic behind it, put some data behind it, put some assumptions behind it with some sound judgment, and then these 3 processes that a lot of them are focused on how to manage those roadblocks, how to manage those variables. Thank you very much for your time.